how would you introduce yourself without talking about what you do or what you have, and without using a label?
That is really interesting. I don't think I've ever been asked that question. There's nothing really to introduce. I'm from Australia. I'm a 36-year-old female. I spend all my time working. When I'm not working, I'm reading or researching or on a horse.
What do you value the most?
People. I actually don't think that I have always highly valued that. I used to be a huge people pleaser when I was younger.
Hmm.
And so you could potentially say that I valued people, but that's not really valuing people back then. So my action
Hmm.
looked as though I valued people, but my integrity internally was not really people focused. So it's been a quite a long journey to actually understand what people mattering means and what valuing people means, and shedding all the superficial beliefs of what that looks like and feels like.
Yeah. There must have been something that caused this transition for you where you're like, I'm a people pleaser, and now I'm not. And like, not being a people pleaser counterintuitively, it sounds like came as a result of valuing people.
Yes,
Is that right?
ironically. Yes.
Yeah, explain that one. I mean, I think I have thoughts. I can probably tell you how I interpret it, but I'm curious to hear from you.
So people pleasing is more focused about perception of self
Mhm.
from others, whereas valuing people means that how they are, who they are, how they come is respected and they matter in that state.
So, people pleasing is, you're saying it's not valuing necessarily who they are as a person. It's trying to achieve some goal.
Yes, absolutely. So it's trying to achieve a certain perception of yourself
Yeah.
through the action of helping somebody else. So a self perception as well as an external perception.
Yes. And it's interesting. I love that when we talk about who you are, and the first thing that comes up is somebody who values people. Where does that relate to authenticity for you?
I think it's more congruent with my natural state without all the expectations of how you're supposed to treat people in situations or what you're supposed to think of people in certain states or certain parts of their life or journeys in their life. It's a more neutral way of interacting with people that has a lot more power behind it. And so for me, I think society taught me that the way to get that understanding was to people please because that's sort of the closest, most normal way to achieve that. And in undoing that belief, I realized that I don't really care about all of the perceptions or the ideas of people or what they should or shouldn't be. I care more about who they are in that moment or in a situation,
And
and
why
possibly
is,
also their
yeah.
potential past
Mhm.
that.
Why is,
Because I don't think that we value being human or humanity enough.
mm, what do you think we value more?
Label, being able to introduce myself and
Right.
everything that I do, because that's so much more impressive than just being a person.
Yeah, it's really hard. And to that point, like when we you meet somebody and you're people pleasing, labels help you, right?
Absolutely.
You talk about that some more, because I know that you're, um, you know, a major proponent of how do we get back to our humanity by shedding some of these things.
I think as a people pleaser, like if we're going to use that thread as an example, you become attached to descriptions of yourself, right? And so you self-identify through those descriptions, and then you externally gravitate based on those descriptions. So even if you're a people pleaser and the actions that you enact for others are not appreciated, you still have this semi moral high ground for what your actions were. So you become self identified or self labeled in a way that isn't actually true in the situation. So for example, like if you were in a certain situation and you needed help, your idea of what is helpful and my idea of what is helpful for you in that situation are potentially two different things,
Hmm.
right? And so whether if I enact what I believe is helpful for you, which isn't actually helpful for you, I still attach to the labels that I was helpful. And then I create labels about you as a person that you're ungrateful or inconsiderate or didn't appreciate. And so then you become a certain description.
Hmm.
And I still attach whatever description I like to myself in that situation because of how I perceive my action. Whereas if you matter to me, what helping you actually matters rather than attaching to the description or the label or the action, then I'm more likely to actually help you in a way that you find helpful.
I'm curious, how did you get to this point where um, you realize that it's almost like you have this allergy to labels? And I'm so curious because I think what I love about this like label thing is that labels can bypass authenticity, right? They can bypass understanding somebody else or understanding self. Um, and I'm curious how you have gotten to this place where you have um, this desire to understand humans beyond.
I still think to a degree I would use labels or definitions so that I can still communicate with people
Mhm.
because, we still understand each other based on those things. But it's more of a lack of attachment to those labels. And I
Mhm.
think the way that I got there was probably when I started my first company and I was trying to identify in the market what that company would do and in the market what my role would be named. And so I tried on, but I think in the first year I was five different things and the company was in five different niches. And I realized that none of them fit. And so as I explored what did fit, there wasn't really a fixed label. We had a very fluid way of working, and I had a very fluid set of skills that I brought to that work. And so probably out of sheer frustration, I started to part with the idea of needing to have a label. And so now in all my interactions, I believe that everything is more multifaceted than just one label. But I also believe that we all have different definitions for labels, just like we have different definitions for words. And so my intention when I do use a label
Mhm.
may be completely different to how you perceive the understanding of that label and vice versa.
Yeah, I like what you said about the non-attachment to the label. Can you tell me more about that?
So with labels, we tend to create an attachment between the thing that we're labeling and the label. And so it's almost like that
Mm.
thing or that person personifies that label. And so everything about that label they are, right? No matter how complex or simple that label is, that becomes the identity that we project to others and to ourselves.
Yeah.
So it's really easy to call a computer, but a computer has multifaceted spectrum of things that it can actually do and achieve. And so what do I use the computer for? And so when we're looking at labeling other people, we how do they use that label? How do they enact that label? Um, what is their intention or their motivation behind that label that we're giving them? And then that makes them less this fixed stoic attachment. So when they act beyond that idea that we have of them, we're not shocked because we understand that they're not completely or only this one thing.
Hmm. And it's like it also allows for curiosity, right? Discovery beyond what you might know about oneself. Um, has that been part of your journey in understanding this?
Absolutely, because I don't believe that we are exactly the same in every situation or in every context of even the same situation.
Mhm. And like over time, we start to. I guess context could be time as well, right? Like over time, you might start to learn more about yourself. And then also the other aspect to it, I think that is interesting is that the label almost it's like a container that you have to stay within.
Yes, it's a level of expectation other people have. And so going back to the idea that we're different in different contexts or different situations or different contextual situations is that we because of the complexity of that situation and maybe differing factors or time or other influences, we may react differently in different situations. And because other people have labeled us a certain way, they can't understand that transition or that change in behavior through across those situations because they have this expectation that we will be a certain way and act a certain way in
Mm-hmm.
all situations. And so that in itself creates a little bit of friction
Hmm.
between people and even between yourself as well. Because if you have labeled yourself in a certain perspective and don't enact that perspective, then there's some dissonance for you internally too,
Yeah, have you found that in your personal journey where you've run into that dissonance and made discoveries about yourself?
every day.
Wow.
Me, every day.
Oh wow. What is a good example of an everyday? I'm sure there's probably like everyday ones and then there's like more, you know, profound ones. I'm assuming you don't have profound discoveries every day. Maybe you do. I don't know.
No, I probably do. But see, with what I do and the different people that I interact with and from different countries on a daily basis, there is always new situations, new cultural context, new language barriers, understandings that I don't always have prior to walking
Hmm.
into a situation. And so uh, you really have to be able to review in real time what is actually happening and how you show up in that situation and whether or not it is completely integral. It might feel, uh, by definition, it might feel correct, but is it actually appropriate?
What's an example of a realization that you've had that changed the way that you are approaching your life?
A really big one was understanding the words that I was using that I wanted to enact and what they were actually achieving and how they were achieving it. So, for example, control and composure are a really good example
Hmm.
because I was brought up to be in control, right?
Hmm.
So, control was a good thing, right? If you were in control of a situation or you were in control of yourself, that was a positive aspect to have. But the problem with control is that you have to control everything externally. It's not internally focused, right?
Yeah.
And so when you work with different people in different situations, you can't actually control other people without being horrible or manipulative, right? And so, and also your sense or your idea of control in that situation may not derive the best outcome.
That's the
And
most
so,
important part.
mhm. And so I consider control an external projection of,
Hmm.
and so it's not actually, as to me now, it's not actually a positive aspect of my character. And so I had to shift my understanding to what do I actually want to bring to that situation? Because I do want to bring some. in the idea that control is positive, I wanted to bring something to the situation, but it needed to be more internally focused. And so I then derived composure as its opposite, right? So it still brings
Mm.
a cool, calm, empowered presence to any situation, chaotic or otherwise, but it's internally focused rather than controlling external factors. And so then I am actually able to draw out the best possible outcome from the situation rather than try and make people or coerce people to do what I think is the best possible outcome.
I love that. That framing is really interesting to me. I'm trying to relate it to my own mental models things. It's so you're saying that there's external control and then there's like internal composure. And those are two ways that a person might go about trying to influence the world around them, in particular other human beings, right? Because if we're talking about non-humans, there's other, maybe external control is better for non, right? For right,
Yeah, I don't know.
but yeah, yeah, yeah.
Sounds
I don't
good for those
I
other
don't think the
things.
dishes are gonna. No matter how composed I am, the dishes aren't gonna get themselves done. I wish. um, but so for other humans, I what's kind of mapping to in my brain is, I guess the external control maps, but the internal, the composure maps to like maybe confidence or um self understanding or internal locus of control. Have you heard that term? I think it's a psychoanalytic term where
And I prefer the idea of self possession.
self what?
Self possession.
Self possession. Interesting. Could you explain that one?
So my idea of self possession is you're internally like your gravitational force is internal rather than external.
Hmm. I see. Which is like the internal locus of control. That makes sense. Um, and what it also maps to is, I feel like a lot of us are trying to, especially in this age of social media where everyone has a presence online, everyone can have a platform and post content like we are doing right now. Um, People often want to be able to show up in these um, platforms and in the content, and they want to show up and they want to be confident and composed. They want to appear authentic, and they want to appear in such a way that people will listen to them. And some of the best advice I've seen that's been given to people to achieve that is to focus on showing up authentically and letting go of the need for external validation. Is that similar to what you're talking about composure? Like composure means I don't need you to validate my perspective for me to believe my perspective is worth putting out there.
I think control and composure are probably an offshoot of that, because obviously
Mm,
part of control is controlling the perception of yourself also in that situation, even if
mm,
and that's probably a big part of the difference between control and composure is that you're embodying the thing that you're bringing to the situation, whereas control is you're basically just controlling the perception that other people have of you in that situation to be that thing rather than you actually being that thing. Um, but I think that external validation is just a focus on orientation, right? And so we're
mm,
so externally orientated that we need validation. So the reason that we do
mm,
the social media or the interview or the podcast or whatever it is because we're externally orientated. And then we go down the path of all the external things that follow that. So the validation and the likes and the views and, the comments and the feedback and things like that. And so the flip side is the internal, which comes from the expression of self, which is far more authentic.
Mm-hmm. And the the creation of this podcast for me is a forum for me and others to express themselves first and foremost. And then if the likes and those things come, that's wonderful. Is that a real life example of composure versus control, or are there better examples?
No, I definitely think that is in the context of putting out content is definitely the difference between external orientation and the internal orientation. I think one of the most interesting internal orientations of your particular platform is that it's also exploratory for you. And
Mm-hmm.
so part of the purpose of you doing this was so that you could talk to a variety of people to understand a variety of perspectives for your own development, which makes that very internally focused.
Yep. Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful to have a specific example. So the intention is what changes. It ends up changing the outcome, is what you're saying. It can change um, how effective you are. Is that right?
I think in this instance, when we're talking about externality and internality, it's more the orientation first,
Mhm.
then the intention.
Can you put that in a practical example?
So intentions can be applied to both internal and external
Hmm.
scenarios or orientation. And so the orientation first means that you're internally focused with a certain intention for yourself. So I can be internally focused and still have the intention that I want to bring value to other people, which would
Mm-hmm.
be an external offshoot of being internally focused. But my intention can shift as long as my orientation is internal.
That makes sense.
But if my
Okay.
orientation is external and my intention is to bring value to other people so that I am then recognized for that, then we're external. So external orientation, external intention.
Yep, that makes sense. Um, so I want to bring this back to um, the notion of authenticity, because it feels to me that um, that external orientation can be at odds with showing up authentically. Is that correct?
Yes. Because anything that is externally orientated, and unfortunately, we're not naturally wired, sorry, we're socially conditioned to be externally orientated. That our society
Mm-hmm.
supports that and shows us that from when we're young. Our natural state, however, is internally orientated. And so
Mm.
if you are externally orientated, you can't be authentically internally orientated because that's your natural state.
Um, so this is something that maybe you can help me understand. You basically said that.
Maybe.
Yeah, we'll try. We will
Oh,
try.
God.
We will try. Um, you said that society kind of pushes us to be externally oriented, but we are inherently internally oriented. And it boggles my mind because society is sort of, I have this, I have noticed this pattern. It's not always true. And here's an example where it's not always true. That what happens at the micro level often happens at the macro level, right? So if you're saying we're inherently internally oriented, then it would follow that at the macro level, the society would also be internally oriented, but it is not. And I know, like I think the answer has something to do with um, tribalism, right? But that's just kind of like a vague hand wavy. I would love to explore this more because I'm so curious why, if it's so, if as human beings, I notice that humans that are internally oriented, that are show up authentically or in line with their own values, they tend to have greater impact on the world around them. They tend to have more fulfilling lives. Um, then why is it then that we have evolved to where that's not um, an integral part of society? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that part of that understanding has been lost throughout our history. So we we now, I mean, I'm only 36, so my whole life, everything has been an external orientation. But I am led to believe that that is my natural state. That is my natural human state because it's what I'm shown and what's
Mhm.
exemplified to me on a daily basis from a very young age. We don't look past that experience, or we very rarely look past that experience,
Mhm.
right? And so, even if you want to go back 100 years, it's still a society that's very externally orientated. And so we're just compounding. We didn't create this, last couple of generations didn't create the external orientation, but it is perpetuated through the examples that we're given and the examples that we then enact because we believe that that is the state of humanity.
Right. Um, and what perpetuates that? Like to me, I think one of the things, like right now, we're seeing that social media is perpetuating. And
Mhm.
I guess
As a
like my,
symptom. Yeah.
yeah, just a very high level, again, just high level hand wavy answer for me is, and is that um, it's more advantageous for me if you are externally oriented. Is there a clue there about why we are where we are?
Yeah. I mean, all we have to do is look at like the last 150 years of marketing.
Hmm.
Everything is externally orientated. And I need something that's outside of myself to be better, to be smarter, to be more human. I have this conversation a lot with people about AI, and they're like, how do we get AI to help humanity? Well, AI is programmed by humanity in today's state. So it's only going to further perpetuate the state that we
Hmm.
exist in now. It's not going to
Yes.
rectify that or bring us back to our natural state because we don't actually understand our natural state to program it into AI to teach us that,
Yeah.
right? So these are just symptoms or expanding symptoms of things that, or threads or patterns that we've experienced over hundreds of years that are now moving into or transferring into the modern idea of technology and society. We're basically still doing the same thing.
Yeah. And now we've created a an automated mechanism to amplify it globally, and fueled by the drive for revenue, as you mentioned, advertising and marketing. But at the same time, this conversation is happening right now. And this isn't the only one that's happening. Like this is here because I was inspired by other similar conversations happening. And I don't have data here either, but I have the sense that this conversation is growing larger and larger. And what do you think is causing that to happen now, especially at a time when the opposite is being pushed really hard, right?
Well, I mean, there is the aspect of that same technology that perpetuates the same pattern is also a platform to perpetuate a different pattern, right? And so there is a
Mm-hmm.
lot more exposure to that alternative conversation. The most interesting thing about this conversation is that it's not new to the modern era. It has been
Mm-hmm.
happening thousands of years ago in books that people have never read, right? Or in
Mm-hmm.
um, original testaments of religious material that most people have never had access to. And so one argument can be made that it wasn't a widely accepted idea back then because you had to be able to read and you had to have access to a book and you had to be able to understand the language that the book was written in because it wasn't translated into 23 different languages. like books are today. There was no television, there was no YouTube. So that message gets lost in illiteracy and access,
Mm.
whereas we don't have that problem today. So we can bring that conversation. So it's not a new conversation. It's just a conversation that now has new platforms to expand and reach a majority of people, because there's still not everybody that has access to the technology that we have access to create this interview. But it's a more prevalent conversation, a more accessible conversation because of the platforms that we do have access to.
What's a good example of an earlier, because before the age of like TV, it was texts basically, or books, right? Do you have an example of that kind of inspiration? Um, I'm curious.
I mean, Plato, Socrates didn't write anything,
Hmm.
but there's plenty of stuff written by Socrates. But you can get coming further. There you've got Emerson,
Hmm.
Weber. There is a ton of this material that exists that we're not directed to because it doesn't serve that external purpose. But it's also because I do believe that because of what we've perpetuated in the society that we've built, these ideas are beyond comprehension when we try and apply them to what exists, which creates a dissonance, which makes them irrelevant.
Hmm. Yeah, and the individual has to be ready to hear the message too, right?
Mhm.
So this takes me to the next topic that's related here. I started to become interested in the topic of authenticity because um, I felt that I wasn't getting enough meaningful connection with other humans in my life. And then I learned that I need to have better connection with myself first. Um, can you talk about that?
So that changes your orientation, right? And
Hmm.
so you can have a deeper connection with somebody when you understand your own humanity because you can understand their humanity rather than their labels or the superficial projection of themselves.
Right, because I'm also a recovering people pleaser, by the way. And I say recovering, right, because we don't ever fully, at least for me, I don't know that I'll ever fully be recovered. It's an ongoing battle. But
No, I believe that there is definitely a point where you release all of that. I do believe that. It's in your
okay,
future. I can
thank
see
you.
it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. um so when I was doing a lot of that people pleasing, um like to your point, what you're saying is that I'm orientating myself to whatever they're putting out there, which might also be non-authentic. But even if it is authentic, I'm still orienting to them. And so I'm not going to get a visceral understanding of their experience because I don't have a visceral understanding of my own, is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
And
It's a
and
little
so
bit like trying to explain to somebody what a different country's like,
mm,
right? Like they cannot actually completely fully embody the understanding that you have from
mhm,
being there and witnessing it and experiencing it yourself. And so, if you don't have an experience of your own humanity or an understanding of your own self, and that doesn't mean that you have like this fixed idea of yourself either. It means that you
mhm,
understand that you're messy and complex and complicated and all over the place, right?
yeah.
But it allows you to understand all their messy and their complex rather than this stoic projection.
Mm. Yes. I feel very attacked with the stoic projection. Not in this moment, but my old self. That was my
Your measuring stick.
what yeah, and it was a survival mechanism, um,
Absolutely.
w- because because it was so hard to connect with myself because actually this is a question for you, like what what why do you think it is that it's so hard for people and I would love to hear for you where you've had this challenge to connect with themselves. Cause we hear this all the time, right? We're told this all the time, like know yourself, everyone's on a journey to find themselves, right? This is just, but there's a barrier for a lot of us. And what does that frequently look like?
I would like to attach to the end of that, everyone's on a journey to find themselves in the world,
Mm,
right? Because most of what society structures us to chase or endeavor to do is to find a place in the world. Find the people you
hmm
belong with, find the
Ooh,
job that you're good at,
ooh,
find the thing that you love to do. And so
mm-hmm,
that's all still very external, and it all still
mm,
puts us in a place in the world outside of ourselves, right? And I'm not saying those things are inherently bad, because
right.
we still need to interact with other people and do things. We can't just sit in can't be in monk
Yeah.
mode 100% of the
Yeah.
time. But when what all we're doing is finding the place that we belong,
hmm
we're still externally orientated.
Until we realize that we already belong.
Yeah. Right. And we are just as ourselves sitting in monk mode is an acceptable state of being.
Right. Until we need to find some food or shelter or, and then,
Right. And so that
yeah.
and then the inherently like those things still need to happen. Right. But
hmm
we can't be internally orientated when those are the things that we measure or create self perception by,
Yeah.
right? So they can be things that we do or things that we uh, enact, but they are not our self definition or our self perception. They're not our identity.
Yeah. You're saying that when we start to make our barometer of success be external, then it's not possible for us to be internally oriented anymore. So if
Yes, the
my goal
internal
is,
orientation comes first.
yeah, so to put that into concrete, to make sure I'm understanding this, if my measure of success for this interview is to get 1 million views, then I'm going to be approaching it with a non-internal orientation, which means that it's likely going to be done a lot differently. Like I'm probably going to be trying
Few
to find ways.
buzzwords and
Yeah, I'm gonna be
SEO
like,
found.
yeah, SEO or like tell me about that last yeah that interview I had with the Yush where he's talking about that meme on Instagram that triggered him. Like tell me about some juicy stuff that's going on that triggers you, something that I can turn into
Yeah.
clickbait. But like rather than having an authentic conversation, that if I were to measure the success based on that, it would change the nature of this conversation.
It would also change the way that you approach this conversation. So it's very clear through
Mhm.
this conversation that you were trying to figure out the question that you want to answer to, rather than expecting or directing the conversation to get a certain answer.
Mhm. Yes, it's exploration. And if I
Yes,
had a
rather than
specific
definitive
answer in
and
mind, good
yes.
observation.
I think I think it's also really important to highlight the fact that we say authenticity and we use authenticity quite freely, but most people would believe that they are truly authentic to the state that they believe that they are in, right? So if I
Mhm.
say that are brought up in a society where our natural state, we're determined by an external orientation, and we believe that to be the natural state of humanity, majority of people would consider that how they enact with the world authentic because it is authentic to the model that they
Mhm.
have of
Right.
their natural state of humanity, right? And so there is a level of inauthenticity in the sense that there are people that are genuinely and openly inauthentic to themselves, whether it be that state of human nature or the perceived state of human nature. But the authenticity that you're describing now is and an authenticity that is created by self. So it's an internally orientated state of authenticity.
Mm. Yeah, actually, that takes me to an interesting question, which is like, how do you discern? Because basically what you just said was that um, I might think that something is authentic to me, but it's actually me just being driven by societal expectations or customs or whatnot, right? Like,
Perceived examples that have set for you. Absolutely. Right.
right.
Mhm.
And so this would be really helpful for, I think, for me and other people, which is how do you discern, when you're being driven by external orientation versus internal orientation?
Well, is that the question, or how do you discern to what level you're being authentic?
Hmm, that's a better one.
Right? Because so your degree of authenticity is based on your orientation. And so that's an
Mm,
easier place to start. So, for example, when I was a people pleaser, I would have said being a people pleaser was my natural inherent state. When
right.
I used control instead of composure, I would have said that being in control of situations was my natural inherent state. But clearly, if I can change them, they're not.
Mhm,
If I can change the orientation, they're not really my natural state. So the way that I discovered the difference between my internal orientation and my external orientation is I wrote a list of all the characteristics that I either thought had or I wanted to have.
mm.
And then I Googled the definition.
Oh,
And naturally, by definition, some are internally orientated and others are externally orientated. But then you have to attach your intention or motivation, right? Because again, if even if something is, it has to be internally orientated and not the cause or reason of it. So I can't be composed so other people perceive me as composed, because then that makes
right.
it an external orientation,
Yep.
right? And so
Yeah.
I have to be composed because I want to be composed
Whoa.
and I am composed in myself.
Yeah. Sorry. This is really big, right? Like, this is huge because, like, so the reason I say that is, I did this 8 week mentorship program that was aimed at, essentially, I didn't describe it that way. It was aimed at getting me internally,
Orientated.
help me with the oriented. Thank you. It's gonna
Mhm.
take some time for this to integrate. But but then my motivation was because I wanted to be, a better leader, better at connecting with other people, be more successful in my life in terms of like career, relationships, to be able to do this confidently in a way that people aren't like, oh, this is awkward watching this guy. Like, um, that was my motivation. And what happened was, even though that was the motivation, over time that stopped being the motivation, and then the motivation became internal. And that was like sort of the turning point when it really clicked for me. I just realized that was that turning point when it moved from, so it's okay if it starts external. At least it did for me. It was okay for me.
I mean, the most in society today, most of the ways you're going to reach that point are externally offered, right? Because anybody that's internally orientated is not using clickbait to get your attention. So
To
you
be fair, I do use clickbait in the thumbnails because I know that if I don't, the algorithm won't show it, and then somebody's going to miss out on something that might be helpful. But that's the motivation. But yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah. But that's a great example, right? Of like that sort of scale of that authenticity that sometimes depending on what the motivation is, um, you know, but no, that's, I'm going to go back to this video and I'm going to like write this down, what you just described, because I think this is a really helpful framework. So what I've seen is where people do the values exercise, right? Where you, and I did this, where you take all the possible values, you stack rank them, and the exercise of having to choose the one
I
forces
drew
you.
mine on a tree. Hmm.
Oh wow, a tree.
Yeah.
Interesting. That's even more okay. That could be even more interesting. Um, and I could see why you would do that because some of them might live at the same level because they're in a similar cluster of category. Um, but you're talking about because my question was like how you discern what level of authenticity you're at, and so then it wasn't values that you were talking about. It was something else. It was what was it that you were
So it was characteristics basically, or your
characteristics?
intention or motivation. Yeah,
Yeah,
right. So because we bring like authenticity is how you bring it back to yourself, right? So how do you
yeah,
self-identify? What are you self-identifying with? And whether are you using it for external control over perception or internal control over perception, or is it actually an internal focused way of being that you value?
yeah. And so maybe this is why. Um, so I'm a member of the LGBTQI plus community, and
Mhm.
one thing I've noticed is that we you've heard of the closet. Everyone's heard of the closet, right? We have to come out of the closet. We don't have to, but
No, you don't know, but it's the perception that's given, and
yeah,
historically the situation that society plays.
yeah, and the reason that we do it is because um, it's related to this whole authenticity thing where if you aren't, then if you aren't coming out of the closet, then you're not able to go about living your life in a way that honors what's authentic to
For
you
truth. Mhm.
because um, you have to then, if you're homosexual, you have to then marry somebody that's heterosexual. Otherwise, people will be like, what's going on? Right. Um, and you can't be seen dating somebody of the same sex. Otherwise, people are like, what is going on? And so what's been interesting to me when I've been thinking about this idea of authenticity and the queer community is that, we have these feelings within us that in that categorization you were talking about, where you have to discern if those characteristics are externally or internally driven. They feel very internally driven, right? We can't avoid those feelings. Like I remember
Mhm.
being 12, 13 years old and wondering like, when am I going to start, you know, being interested in women and girls, and it didn't happen. And so it's a very strong place. So, and I think even similarly for somebody who isn't there, somebody who's straight, they can still feel that strong characteristic of, this is true to me. I'm attracted to this. And so it's interesting how, I guess what I'm trying to say is that like maybe these notions of sexuality and gender too, which is separate from sexuality, like gender identity, whether you're identifying with your birth gender or not, those can be starting points for people to understand what that feels like to have a authentic internal characteristic. Because I think that might be a question people might have is like, how do I know what that feels like if it's internal versus external? Are you following me?
Yeah, but the thing I found super interesting about your description of how internal all of those feelings feel is
Hmm.
that they're you're internally experiencing them, but they're based on external expectations or structures,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
And
So
so
like,
there is a natural way of judging yourself,
hmm.
even on those internal, on how they measure up externally, right?
Right.
And so that your description that you're providing is less actually an internally driven thing because it doesn't come with that friction, right?
Mm.
That an internally orientated understanding of yourself is actually frictionless. It's
Mhm.
only when you try and fit that into a structure or an external expectation or perspective that it then becomes full of friction. And then you're
Right.
trapped in the closet banging on the wall.
Mm-hmm. An example. What's an example of that friction?
Well, so your expectation that, at when would you be interested in women, right? At 12 years old, I mean, you're already like at 12 years old, you're not even fully sexually or sensually understood or formed or developed, but you're still already expecting. that
Mm.
you would have a certain reaction or perception, right? And
Because
so that
society's
the
telling me that I should.
that is normal, right?
Hmm.
And not even, like,
Mm.
it's not even about the fact that society's screaming it at you, but
Yeah.
if you're in a predominantly heterosexual family, right,
Yeah.
and you're the first homosexual, your whole everything that's exemplified to you is normal, even if
Yeah.
it's not intentional, is that,
Yeah.
heterosexual is majority or this is normal, right?
Hmm.
And so that friction is created by you experiencing things that don't fit with the expectation or example or model that's been shown to you externally.
Yes. And so that friction um gives it a different like quality or feeling to it, is what you're saying.
Yeah. And it does create the orientation externally. It
Mm.
shifts from an internal orientation to an external orientation once it's being measured against something else.
Hmm. Right. Because it's just like their very label that we use, queer, is like different, weird, other.
It's other. Yeah, it creates an other.
Hmm.
Yep. Mhm.
Whereas the reality is it's human
You're a human being. Mhm.
because I'm a human being and it's a characteristic of me. But I think, does it still stand though that forgetting about the expectation part,
Mhm.
but without the expectation, the feeling of having that characteristic of that drive towards something um, is a authentic feeling that I can anchor off of and say, oh, that's what an authentic characteristic feels like.
Provided it doesn't have the friction attached to it. Yes. As soon as
Once I've
one
let
as
go of that.
yeah, how it exists before you're externally measuring it or placing it
Hmm.
externally into a social structure, that the feeling before that is your internal resonance, your internal orientation.
Right. And so I think what you're suggesting is like this need to put all of these characteristics we have into neat little boxes creates friction and makes it hard for us to experience them authentically.
Mhm. Absolutely, because you have to fit into a box or you have to be defined by something.
Mm, interesting. Um, is there an example of that in other parts of, like, for you? Are there examples like that you've experienced?
So I mean, there's probably a couple. We can go back to the easy example of my business and trying to name it or niche
Let's
it.
go with a
So,
hard example.
existing. Okay, well, we can go with a hard example, right? So I got married at 23 years old
Oh,
because
wow.
I thought that
Uh,
was the expectation. So everybody in
mm,
my family had met
hmm.
their forever husband or wife when they were
Yeah.
16. They married that person
Yeah.
and they were together forever. And I just expected that everybody met, no matter whether it was a good relationship or a bad relationship. The person that you met at 16 was the person that, you lived
Hmm.
the rest of your life with. And so I was married for, I think it was 9 months or 10 months, and realized that that was not at all congruent with me. And I don't know anything about being queer in a very heterosexual orientated society, but I do understand what it's like to be in the closet scraping at the wall because the life that you've paid for yourself and created for yourself is
Hmm.
so incongruent.
Yep.
Probably the only difference is I actually had absolutely no idea what was congruent. I didn't
Ooh.
like, this was just everything that I was experiencing was just so incongruent. And I had no idea what was congruent, but I needed to get out of the closet to
Yeah,
feel
I
that
actually like
expression.
that. No, I'm glad you did because I believe that it's a great metaphor that we're all there, right? That we're all dealing with that
In
closet in
some
some.
degree. Mhm.
Hmm.
To some degree. Yep,
I mean, that's basically
definitely.
what we've been talking about here. Is most of this conversation is that our, like you were saying before, the inherent state is to not be in there, and then society says, "Oh, in you go."
Yeah. Right. And not even I don't even always think it's society. I also think that
Mm,
some of the time it's our perception of the external expectation. Because
Yeah.
if I had really asked my parents if they had expected me to marry the guy that I met at 16, they probably would have said no, right?
Yeah.
But it was my perception of that external stimuli that made me believe that that was normal. And if I wanted to be normal, then I had to do what everybody else had done.
How did you know that it was incongruent? After was you said 8 or 9 months? You said,
Well, I know I actually, if I had listened to myself, I knew it was incongruent well before that.
oh,
But,
interesting.
well, like, yeah, well before I got married. But I didn't understand myself or know myself enough to be able to stand up for that or believe in that. So I was just going with the expectation. I was on the expectation train all the way to station married.
And then 8 months go by, and then what?
Nothing changed. I think I had
Mm,
I think I had this expectation that I once I got married things would change. And I think it was that stark contrast of absolutely nothing changing that made it more real
mm.
and made it more the rest of my life
What did you expect to
than doing.
change?
Uh, I suppose I probably had an expectation of respect changed with, somebody, you being somebody's wife and there being your husband. Like, if you're going to make those vows and take those commitments, I definitely probably expected a higher level of respect in the relationship. But I also expected to become more a team.
Mm,
And that also didn't sort of happen. And it was a super unhealthy relationship, regardless of either of those two factors from both perspectives. So before I got married, I definitely knew something was wrong, but I was so far in on the train with no stops that I could see that I didn't get off. And I sort of, if you're going to commit to something and do something, I'm a follow it all the way to the end kind of. Well, I was back then,
mhm,
and so I followed through on my commitment. And once I did, and it still felt wrong. And I think too, I was immersed in how wrong it felt because there was no
mm.
escape. I'd made the decision and I was in it. It was just overwhelming.
I can imagine, um, especially if you felt all that pressure to stay in it. The pressure that you felt to get into it was probably similar.
But all of that pressure was of my own making. Like I said,
Yes.
if I had actually spoken to somebody or asked somebody, they would have told me otherwise.
Have you forgiven yourself for that?
Oh, absolutely. I actually think it's one of the best things I've ever done
Hmm.
because if I had not, I would not be who I am today.
Yeah, because that was another question I had was it seems like you learned more about yourself through that.
Well, that was the thing that taught me that I was allowed to be a person,
Taught you with?
that I was allowed to be a person and
Ah.
not just a set of expectations. I didn't know that at the
Whoa.
time, right? I
Wait,
didn't realize.
that is a quotable one right there. I'm allowed to be a person and not just a set of expectations.
That was the thing. That's how I figured that out.
Wow. So if that hadn't happened, that realization might have come later in your life.
Maybe. I mean,
Maybe
I
not.
also could have not used. Yeah, maybe not. I also could have not used that situation to create that understanding. I could have just wallowed in it and gone down a completely different path.
The reason wallowing in it. That was the reason I was asking about the forgiveness piece because I think a big part of this process of connecting to oneself authentically is um, self compassion and acceptance of where we are, and self compassion for you know the mistakes we might make. Have you it seems like you're a fairly self compassionate person. I haven't heard you say
Am now.
Yeah, I haven't heard you beating yourself up about things, which is interesting. You said you are now, so you haven't always been. What happened?
Ah, well, and probably getting divorced was a really big catalyst for understanding how I treated myself. Being single for a period, like, I mean, so I was in a relationship when I was 16 to when I was 24. And
Hmm.
so, even, and I haven't since then been in a ton of relationships. I've only been in three relationships since then. So in between, there's a lot of being single, there's a lot of spending time with yourself. And when you spend time with yourself, it's probably why we're so addicted to distraction, or
Hmm.
being active or action, is because spending time with yourself, you actually have to listen to how you talk to yourself. It's how you treat yourself. And so when that becomes, I think, not being in a relationship or getting out of a relationship where not being good to one another was part of the problem. And then realizing that I still carried that myself out of the relationship, then made me realize that it was less about how other people treated me and more about how I treated myself. That was not an overnight thing that happened just so, just
Hmm.
takes a lot of doing, for sure. But I also think that when you talk about forgiveness and self compassion, one of our biggest frictions is external perception, right? Because the reason that we can't forgive ourselves is because somebody else was hurt or somebody else thinks a certain way about us or we're perceived in a certain way or our decisions were not, um, approved by other people, right? And so if we're going to harbor ill will against ourselves for decisions that we've made based on other people's possible perception or existing perception, we can't forgive ourselves because it stands
Hmm.
in the way. We're expecting forgiveness from other people to be able to
Could
forgive
you
ourselves.
right, could you give an example of that?
Probably not for forgiveness because I didn't think about it at quite so, um, both like, nuanced at the time. But
Mhm.
for example, when I did get divorced, my family had a certain relationship with my ex-husband and decided to stay in communication with him and not in communication with me. And one of the biggest things that I realized in that through that experience is if all I wanted was respect for my decision, but I couldn't expect respect for my decision if I didn't respect their decision because it hurt me.
Mm.
So I had to respect that they the choices that they made to stay in communication with him and not stay in communication with me. I had to respect that as their choice and then move on with how I and with respect for my own decision. And so I think that, there was a lot of forgiveness that comes with that because, 5 or 6 years down the track when we did start to recommunicate with each other, there was a lot of layers to that. But I handled forgiveness the same way with myself when we weren't speaking. And so by the time we came back to some kind of communication where we were rebuilding a relationship, it was a lot easier to have already forgiven myself.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting because it seems like it can go in both directions, right? Like being able to
Absolutely.
forgive yourself can make it easier to forgive others, and being able to
Mhm.
forgive others can make it easier to forgive yourself.
I think it's easier if you learn how to forgive yourself to forgive other people, to
Hmm.
really forgive other people.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's coming up for me is another emotion or idea here, which is like jealousy and envy. And one thing that I've learned about those feelings is that oftentimes when I'm jealous or envious of somebody else, it's usually because I'm not giving myself permission to do the thing that they're doing.
Yeah,
And
they're really good indicators for what you actually want.
yes,
Mhm.
Yeah. So like if you're struggling to forgive somebody else, then it might be an indicator that you're struggling to forgive yourself.
Like to forgive yourself. Mhm. And so as like while we say internal orientation, your
Yeah.
external orientation does explain to you where your internal orientation is off,
Mm. I have
which
to
is
sit
what
with
you're
that
just
one for a second.
explaining.
Yeah.
But it's basically what you're explaining. Like your
Hmm.
external dissonance with being jealous of somebody publishing a
Hmm.
book or having a TV show or whatever is because you have not given yourself permission. And it's actually, and it's less when you feel that way, like authentically, if we go back to the internality of it, it is less about the thing that they have, like the TV show or the best selling book, and more about the action that you need to take to have that. So
Yep.
you would be, you would have a desire to write, but have blocked yourself from writing something, anything.
Hmm.
You may have blocked yourself from having a public expression of self or a thought, and so it's less about the thing they have and more about the action that you won't take for yourself.
And so then it can be this beautiful thing that can drive you to the actions that you need to take for yourself.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Um, but it has such a bad reputation. It's another example of this thing we were talking about at the beginning where if it's good for us, why is society not pushing it?
Yeah, but see, jealousy and envy come with a bad reputation because of the way we choose to act in the spirit of those things,
Hmm.
right? And so it's the same as like we're not taught to disagree well. We're not taught to do the thing that we want well. We're taught to take it from someone else or diminish somebody else's experience, right? And so that is jealousy and envy in itself are indicators. They're not actually ugly, but it's what we attach to those emotions and the actions that we take in response to or in because of those emotions that one automatically takes us from internal to external because we're now already fully active, responsive in the reactive in the external. But we also don't, we distract ourselves with those actions and don't take the actual action that the indicators are giving us because we're caught up in the reaction.
Yes. I mean, you're now talking about why it's so important to have emotional regulation and not just the ability to regulate, but also to like listen to and sit with and find the meaning or the thing it's pointing to.
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
think.
the guidance, it's like a compass. Your emotions and your reactions are your compass, but we just don't know how to read the compass
And why do you think that is? That like this is something that
because we're
just
so
that bothers,
externally orientated.
which goes back to like why are we externally
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because so we read the compass based on external orientation, right? And so like if we have an emotion in that in that setting, the
Hmm.
external orientation is to be jealous or envious in a horrible way, right? Or a diminishing way.
Yeah.
And so we have the compass, but we're using the wrong tools or instructions to read it. And so instead of internally using those indicators, the compass, to find something that we need, we start externally projecting.
Yeah. And is it also because uh, we're more easily manipulated when it's external? Like I think about um, like politicians and the media and employers and parents, and they often resort to fear to controlling people.
Mhm.
And if people would feel that fear and then stop and take a moment and what is this pointing to, that power might dissipate.
Yeah. Yeah. So we are, because we are externally orientated, we are more open or susceptible to manipulation.
And like so our whole entire it's like our whole entire civilization is built upon this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Our whole, the whole of society is built on externality. Yes.
yes. And so um and I know you've talked about like let's just reset it, right? Is this part of what you talk about when you say, like, maybe we started over?
Yeah. So if we don't even need to start over. Even if we shifted our current society to a more internally focused society,
Mm.
we could still, I mean, we wouldn't have to shockwave or blow anything up or set anything on fire.
However exciting that might be. Yeah.
Yes, right, exactly. Because, everybody's a pyromaniac.
Yeah.
But we could still exist in the structure that we have in a far more peaceful and self-guided, self-possessive way, even through all the noise, even amongst all the noise.
What do you think is the next step for humanity to do?
And I don't think that the same answer is going to apply to everyone because we
Mm.
all are existing in different cultures and we're all existing in different states of those cultures and we're all existing in different socio-economic demographics of those cultures. And so the answer
Mm.
for one person is not going to be the same answer for somebody else. But small things like focusing on emotional regulation or understanding our own characteristics, what about us is externally measured and focused and could potentially be internally focused and shifted. Those small understandings can go a long way. And the more people that are sitting in that space and acting and exemplifying something different, the more people that see that example and the more people that witness something that is different to what a lot of us grow up with as normal.
Do you feel like we're heading in the right direction?
I definitely think the fact that these sorts of conversations are alive and exist uh, is the right direction. It will balance out the fast and rapid trajectory of everything else that we've created. That remains to be seen. But I am actually not adverse to things being set on fire and starting again. So maybe if that explodes, it might reset.
Well, a lot is already on fire here in LA, so maybe it's gonna
Actually,
start
no
here.
pun intended.
Yeah. um, but actually, is an interesting point, which is like, what's at stake? What do you think is at stake if the trajectory? Because
In
you're right,
what
it's like a
in
freight
what
train. It
way?
is a freight train
Yeah.
that is
Mhm.
of external orientation.
Rotation. Mhm.
Yeah.
I don't believe that anything is at stake because we're going to take the freight train. Like anything in the history of humanity, everything that is falsely propped up fails, and that's just
Mhm.
what's happening. It takes time, like the
Yep.
Roman Empire didn't fall over overnight, and the Catholic Church being the dominion ruler over the world didn't change overnight, but those they do change. Those things fall over. So if we're on the freight train and the freight train gathers momentum and everybody's on the freight train, eventually the freight train is going to crash or fall off the tracks, and we will have semi clean slate. So we don't have anything to lose either way because we will eventually get the slate. I do believe
Mhm.
that we have the capacity to do that. Whether we want to do it the easy way or the hard way, well, that that remains to be seen. The freight train, for the reference, is the hard way.
Yeah. Yep. Um, and we tend to do things the hard way as humans. Um,
Yeah.
I, I I think maybe so. To me, what could be at stake might imply that like we might lose something, but I also think it sometimes is like lost opportunity cost too, right?
Yeah, but then I could say that about my marriage or the next relationship I got in after that was not, like all of those things gave me more than I came in with, whether they were bad, they were challenging experiences or what most people would consider negative experiences.
Mhm.
So I'm a big believer in opportunity cost, but I don't believe it applies in this situation.
Mhm. So then, what is the motivation to? I mean, obviously, my motivation to have this conversation is because this is something I'm passionate and care about.
Mhm.
But if you were to pitch it to um, the world leaders, if you know, hypothetically, to say, hey, this is really important, and this is not about protecting us from the next catastrophe. This is more like going to the moon. It's an opportunity. Like, how would you pitch that opportunity?
I would say let's dissolve NASA and then spend all of that money on fixing Earth first. Maybe not all of NASA because there are some things that NASA do that are super, but we spent a lot of money
Mhm.
again externally. We went out into the solar system instead of focusing on Earth first. And so I would just transfer funds that we spend on that and probably have more than enough to fix but everything else.
Wait.
But I don't think this is not a thing that you sell to people, right? So
Mhm.
the thing about being more internally focused and being more human is that it costs the world less money, right? So we're all the countries right now are struggling for money. Everybody is in deficit. Everybody owes or is beholden to some other country for some other thing. And
Mhm.
shifting our focus actually saves us all of that money that we spend on either protecting ourselves from other countries or other people, or that we, lose in the economy when we go through inflation and deflation and economic crisis. And a more internally focused society stabilizes society.
And then we might be able to explore the cosmos in a more efficient way rather than the way we're doing it now,
Mhm.
because maybe we're getting out over our skis.
Well, see, we're just doing the same thing we've always done. We're looking to something outside of ourselves to explain ourselves,
Mhm.
right? Or save ourselves or fix ourselves, right? And
Yeah.
if we were not using those three driving forces,
Wow.
then we would be exploring the cosmos as an expansion of our own understanding of ourselves.
That also is like a paradigm shift moment for me because you know, like this back here is a Batleth from Star Trek, and actually I syndicate this through a Star Trek podcast group that and so some people watching this might be Trekkies, but like one of the things that's interesting about Star Trek is the motivation to seek out new life and new civilizations is to understand ourselves better, and versus the other way around, which is to go out there with an understanding of ourselves and allowing that to drive our exploration. And the reason why the orientation is flipped again is because we're externally oriented. But what's interesting is that we do, like, I'm learning a lot about myself by externally orienting towards this conversation, right? By coming up against your ideas and your thoughts. And so they're not really mutually exclusive. It's just a matter of where you start, I guess, right?
Mm, It depends how you use the information that you receive from me, right? Because this is
Mhm.
my perspective. If you internally review it and figure out what model of what I say you like and don't like or fit in with your beliefs or don't, then you're internally shifting your understanding. So you're expanding yourself
Mhm.
and your preconceived models, right? If you take what I say verbatim without any review, self review, then you've externally orientated to what I've said. But and it's a little so going back to space and cosmos. If we want to take that to a micro level, if we're internally orientated, then we go out into the world to expand ourselves, expand our understanding, and bring in more information to filter through our understand, filter through ourselves to create a broader understanding. Then we're expanding, right? But if we're consuming to distract or create solid frameworks or opinions of ourselves or create another identity, a new identity, one that's already a limitation. It's not an expansion, but it's the same as trying to find answers of ourselves externally.
Mhm.
And there is a difference.
Yeah. I think what I'm taking away from this conversation is that we don't have enough in our society, exploration of humanity and our inner world. But at the same time, I do feel like there's pockets of it. What are some big pockets of it that you've seen that people like myself that are interested in this can seek out?
Well, I don't really believe I've been on math anything that really does what I'm describing. It may exist, but I haven't come across it.
What about like,
And I don't necessarily
oh, go ahead, please go ahead.
know what about like what?
Oh, like psychoanalysis, for example.
Look, I believe everything has merit, but if you're going to look outside of yourself for an explanation that you attach to, then you're only just creating another attachment,
Hmm.
right? And so you need psychoanalysis and spiritual reading, and you need like you need a something of everything so that you can then discern what parts of everything work for you. And psychoanalysis doesn't work for everybody.
Hmm.
Yeah, particularly with people that have a great deal of self hatred and external orientation to fix that self hatred or feed that self hatred. Anything psychological, they utilize as tools, external tools. They don't internalize those tools. And so it's entirely dependent on what you, one, whether you're willing to review the information that you're being given or look for an easy answer to be attached to something. And two, whether or not you, that's an appropriate tool or understanding method for you. It's a little bit like, somebody recommends a book that they think is amazing, and then you try and read it and it's like struggle bus to get through six
Hmm.
pages, and you keep persisting, but you just can't get there, you can't do it. That that book spoke to somebody else. It meant something to somebody
Hmm.
else. They could take something from it. It's not in the way that you perceive information, or it may not be congruent with what you actually inherently believe or want to believe or have the capacity to understand or believe. And so that's not your avenue.
Yeah, there's friction there that suggests that it's not aligned with where you are or your values or your understanding or something like that. Um, but it's something, yeah, 'cause I'm trying to get to, if let's say I was observing this conversation and I said, okay, I want to become more internally oriented. Where do I start?
With where you're externally orientated,
Mm,
right? So my first thing would be like, how many hours a day do you spend on social media?
hmm.
That would like that, and in today's world, that would be my first thing. What were the last five charges on your credit card? What did you spend money on the last 5 weekends? Like these are the things that are going to show you where you invest your energy. And I'm not saying that everything that you do externally is bad, like going out for dinner with friends or, you know, going out to an activity or something that you super enjoy. These are not necessarily bad. But if everything that you invest time, energy, and money into is externally orientated and none of it is internally orientated, then you can start to see which way a degree you're orientated. Some people are completely one way, some completely the other. Some are fluid and change depending on the day or the time for the month. But I, I don't think that it's helpful necessarily to have somebody else tell you how you're externally orientated. Because if you find one, it's kind of like a knitted sweater. Once you find a thread of external orientation and you start pulling it, then that thread alone starts to unravel your understanding of all the ways that you are externally orientated.
Yeah, I totally agree. It doesn't make somebody cannot tell you. They might be able to um, help you on that journey, like you are
Mhm.
right now, by saying, "Here's some things you can do to start." but they can't tell you. You have to do the work. When this sounds similar to what I was doing, what I've been doing recently for this was just looking at how much time, and it's similar to what you said about like, um, I think it maps. How much time am I spending on consumption versus creation?
Mhm.
And
Absolutely.
and if I'm spending a lot of time on, it's not just if, but when I'm spending a lot of time on consumption, and that amount of time out is outsized compared to the amount of time I'm spending on creation, which is what we're doing right now. Um, Not only does it suggest that there's external orientation, but I'm also less happy. I'm less fulfilled when the
Mhm.
focus is on consumption, is heavily tilted towards consumption. And
Yes. And you can go through periods, but again, so now we go external orientation versus intention, right? So, for
mm,
example, for a lot of the papers that I write, I have to externally consume a ton of stuff to understand
yeah,
multiple perspectives, historical influences from, not just one perspective, but all of them, and how then they could potentially become a pattern across societies, right? But I might do that for 3 weeks and not write anything or not write anything whole for myself. It might just be notes or little sporadic ideas or parts of something. But then I might spend 6 weeks where I'm completely focused on the creation of that thing. And so the intention behind my consumption is an internal understanding, right? And so if
mm,
when you're consuming, it's not enough to just say consume versus creation. It needs to be like, what is your purpose or intention of consuming? So you mindlessly just consuming influence, right? Are you watching a very biased perspective of influence? Are you, you know, self-initiating your consumption for a specific purpose, or are you just en masse consuming anything and everything? And does it have an application?
yeah. So basically, consumption to what end? If the consumption is to the end of killing time, that's not creation. But if the consumption is to the end of creating something, like it's to research, it's targeted consumption to research something, then that's creation.
If it is to create something for yourself or understand something for yourself, to form a perspective of your own, then consumption. Like so listening to this podcast and with the intention of deriving your own opinion or perspective or belief or mental model from this conversation is constructive. It's constructive consumption, right? May not necessarily be creation at the time that you're consuming it, but it will influence. And that's the other thing we have to understand is like whether it's constructive consumption or mindless consumption, it still all constructs something,
Mhm.
right?
That's
You
true.
cannot mindlessly consume Instagram reels for 4 hours and think that you have not influenced a mental model, right? That's just so all of your consumption will influence something. It's just whether or not you're self-possessed enough to apply that in a helpful way for your internal orientation.
Yeah. And it's not to say that we should be 100% focused on constructive consumption either, because we do need to wander and explore as well, right?
Absolutely. Mhm.
Man, it is hard to human, isn't it?
See, I disagree. I think it's awesome, but that's just my personal opinion.
Oh man. Yeah. No, I just, when you break it all down, it seems really hard, but when you put it into practice, it, it's practice, and it's
And the
just,
thing is, once you're able to break all that surface externality away, internality does become far easier,
mhm,
right? You just have to understand because it is actually your natural state. Like, and curiosity is part of that state, right?
mhm.
And so if you allow that, um, you it becomes easier to human. It's only hard to human because you're fighting all these things that are not inherently natural for being human.
Yeah, to some extent. I guess the reason why I said that, I was joking, but I was also not joking because um we have, because the example of the mindless consumption of social media, right? It feels like a very default state.
Yes, but see, this is the funny thing about that. So let's call that the easy state, because
Mm-hmm.
it's easy to mindlessly sit there, right? But we
Mm-hmm.
think that anything that is easy up front is just easy. But if we think about the mental models that you create when you're easily mindlessly consuming something, you potentially make your life harder,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so you not only potentially make your life harder, you probably create more external friction with other people. You also potentially create mental models that you are incongruent. So everything is dissonant, everything in your life becomes friction. And so while it may be default or easy to consume, the pattern or the symptoms or the implications that that has long term potentially harm more than help.
Yeah, and I think that's the hard part about being a human, is making that trade-off.
The hardest part of being human is choosing.
That's, yeah, that's what I'm saying, is like, how do you choose that
Yes,
trade-off? Yeah.
this
Because
is.
especially like I've noticed for me, and I think a lot of people, this is probably true. If you sit with yourself and you ask like, why am I doing this mindless scroll? Like you mentioned it earlier, it's hard to sit with yourself and be, deal with yourself, treating yourself the way you treat yourself. Either the self-talk, or it's the emotions. You're avoiding those emotions, or you're avoiding doing something that is emotionally challenging, or having that hard conversation, or doing that task that you're stressed, that's, you want to get it done just right, and so it's hard to do, or whatever. Procrastination. um but to your point, it's going to make my life a lot easier if I say, no, why don't I sit with that emotion right now, or sit with these thoughts, or do that thing, or do one task, one step of that thing. um so like I said, it's that choice, choosing to do the thing that seems harder, makes your life easier in the long run. But how do you condition yourself to make better choices?
I mean, that's an interesting question because I mean, everybody's idea of better choices is
But in this context, that the better choice is to do the thing that is going to um, be congruent with your internal orientation, right?
mhm,
So how do you condition yourself? I think that's the question, to choose the things that are
to
internally
choose.
oriented.
I don't. I so to begin with, I don't necessarily think you have the capacity to make that choice. I think it's more
Hmm.
about understanding the external choices that you're making, right? So rather than trying to make a different choice, just become aware and observe all the externally focused choices. And then with that observation, you kind of naturally deduce whether that actually serves you or not.
So you're saying sunlight is a disinfectant, just shine a light on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So when many years ago, when I first started my first company, I had this older friend who had her own business as well. And she said to me, how do you get so much done in a day? I was like, I don't know. I just, work for every hour there is of every day and I'm constantly doing something. And later in the same conversation, she was looking at, it was when the iPhone first started to tell you like how often you spend on a particular app. And she's like, oh my goodness, I spent 5 hours on social media, like on daily average. And I looked at her and I'm like, anyone who can't get anything done, like in that 5 hours. Here, so I showed her my calendar. Like if I just took a 5 hour block from my day, all the things that I would fit into the time that she would sitting on social media. And so then I said to her, all of the things that you didn't get done, you actually had time today, but you didn't do
Hmm.
them.
Hmm. Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily mean that if somebody chooses to recognize that, oh, like, hey, I am my external orientation is here. I'm on the social media and I'm putting 5 hours a day in it. That they're going to then, those 5 hours are going to be spent just working the whole time. That's true for you because that a lot of the work that you do aligns really well with your values because you're,
And sates my curiosity and my creativity all at
yeah,
once.
because you've built all
Yeah.
of that work for yourself, right?
Mhm.
But a lot of us
Yes.
don't have that. Some of us, we are built, we're working within a larger system, somebody else's values. And that's not a bad thing or a good thing. Like it just is. And we need all of these things as a society and as humans, we need all these things. But like, so as an example, like I, I'm a video game. I love video games, and I would find that I would never be able to finish a video game until recently. I finally am able to finish video games. Um, and it's because before I my motivation for playing the video game was to just kill time. Like I'm bored, I'm gonna kill time. But then I switched it to now. I love that it gives me this like it's like a sandbox to practice facing a challenge, failing, and then trying again until I can master it and complete it and move on to the next level. Right. And it's one that is entertaining and fulfilling and that connects me to a larger community of other people doing the same thing. Um, and so again, that's an internal orientation. Um, and so this isn't, I don't want people to think that like internal orientation is all about work. It's also about play too, right?
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And it's a beautiful thing because I think one thing I've noticed as a human that the older I get, like it's harder to play, right? Have you seen this?
Oh no, see, I went the other way.
Oh wow.
See,
Well, of
I was
course, because of your
9
internal
going on,
orientation.
yeah, right. So I was
Yeah.
9 going on 21. And so
Uh-huh.
I was an adult, and I mean, I'm still an adult, I'm still a very
Yeah.
responsible adult, but
Yeah.
I find it easier to be
Hmm.
silly and play and have fun now that I am internally orientated than I did when I was externally orientated because I was so concerned about perception
Hmm.
of failing or looking silly or being silly that I wouldn't engage.
I mean, I think that's why it's so easy to have these conversations with you because we're not having these conversations to accomplish this. There's like a goal in mind, right? We're just exploring thoughts and ideas. It's a form of play in a way, even though it ends up creating something constructive and helpful for both of us.
Mhm.
And that's why play is important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, I work a lot, but my work is not always consistent of external output. And so being curious and learning things and understanding, creating patterns, my own derived patterns is a form of play and curiosity for me. Like I am
Mhm.
in my element if I have 10 books open and paper all over the place and I've got scribbled notes everywhere and post-its all over everything. That to me, I mean, I'll be giggling to myself in that situation. And so it isn't necessarily work. It is more an go for an idea of play. But then at the same time, I like to be outside. So, and the paper doesn't like the wind too much.
Right.
I have to trade off, when I'm outside and I'm active or I'm, dancing around in the street, which I have done. Um, those things matter too. So it's just a matter of which outlet best suits what I need today when I'm not in work mode, in external output mode.
When you don't have a specific deliverable that you need to produce.
Mhm.
Awesome. Um, we didn't get to talk about rejection. It's something I like to talk about in this context because I think something that holds a lot of us back from internal orientation is rejection, right? I think like as a great example, you did that marriage when you did because you were afraid. You thought that there was expectations on you, and if you didn't meet those expectations, you would why
And I wasn't normal. Mhm.
you would be
What place can I have in
rejected.
society? Hmm.
And I think that might be holding a lot of people back. If somebody's listening to this, they might say, "Okay, great. Like I'm going to But like if I stop doing the mindless scrolling, I can't keep up on the latest TikToks and latest memes. And if I'm not binge watching shows, I can't keep up on all of that. And I can't have, I'm going to get rejected by my friends because they're like, you're so out of touch. That's just one example, but there's lots of examples like that
Absolutely.
where people might fear, rightfully so, fear internal orientation because they're afraid of rejection. Um, yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Rejection is always super interesting because it is a projection of power to somebody else on your validity.
Mm,
And so understanding that in being attached to not being rejected or having a strong disinclinement to being rejected means that another person basically owns your identity or
wow.
owns a part of your identity. And so when you realize that rejection is handing over or being fearful of rejection or acting in a way to stop being rejected or prolong being rejected, you're actually just being owned by another person. Like your identity is owned by another person. And so that, like, we're going to shed light on the negative thing that you see. The opposite side of that, of not being fearful of rejection, is having a healthy relationship. That rejection is not necessarily a loss, but a gain. And so, you and I talked about this earlier. When you're rejected for a contract or a position or as a friend, you know, it it's not a personal thing, right? It's just a matter of weeding out what is good for you, what is best for you. And if you do change and part of your external scope of people or situations doesn't change, then have you really changed, right?
Mm,
Have you really developed past a certain point? Because, yes, right now you might need to be trendy to keep up with all your friends. And as you change and evolve and develop in a different way and become more curious about things that are not trendy and actually are internally orientated for you, you may lose some of those friends because they're not all going to be on the same experience as you. But do they have to
mhm.
be? Right. And then you're going to experience new people and other situations that are found on this other thread of things. But if you're truly internally orientated, there is no fear of rejection because you aren't attached to the perception of other people or the belonging
Mhm.
of other people. If you're internally orientated, you have a sense of self possession, which means that you are the one that's empowered without those attachments.
Yep. What you're saying um, resonates with me, and you've said it in a way that's a little different than I've been thinking about it, which is that when you allow fear of rejection to drive you, it's like you're giving power to other people. Can you say that again?
So you give your ownership over,
Ownership.
like, the ownership of self over to somebody else. Because you can use power, you can, but there is something very different about
Mhm.
performing to ensure that you're not rejected because you become the thing that the person expects you to be, right? So you don't own yourself. So I like to use ownership rather than power in those situations where you're enacting in a certain way to become acceptable because it is less about power and more about ownership because you don't own yourself. You're literally a puppet or a subject of somebody else's will and expectation.
Or I said another way, you're giving your agency over to them.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I
It's like
like
giving
that.
somebody else the title of your house, right?
Yeah,
Like you bought your house and you pay for your house, but then all of a sudden you don't want to be rejected. So you give somebody else the title of your house. They basically own where you live. They are the proprietor of your every action, want, desire, and thought.
mhm. Yeah, because the way I've thought about it is that um, fear of rejection. can cause you to betray yourself, which is also
Mhm.
true. But
Mhm.
then betray yourself, why? Because you're giving agency over to somebody else.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
that's where peer pressure comes from, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so the idea that we need to be accepted by a social structure or a person or a society is what gives the perpetuation of the freight train that we mentioned earlier the power,
Yeah.
right? Because you can still be a functioning member of society and not and still be rejected by it.
Mhm.
But when you're measuring stick as society and you're rejected by it, you become less a functioning sense of yourself and more a functioning cog within that.
And then you're more likely to just perpetuate the structure than change it.
Absolutely,
And
because you're too
the
scared of being rejected from it.
yeah, and the reason I bring that up is because you know, people there's a lot of emphasis right now on like hustle culture and entrepreneurship and you know boss lady and crypto dude Chad whatever
Magnate. Hmm.
yeah
Yep.
like all of this and it really I think it really is people wanting more agency. Like they just want more agency. They think I will have more agency when I am the boss, you know.
No, you have to. No, agency doesn't come from circumstances. Agency comes from self, right? And
Hmm.
so you can still be an entrepreneur and have no agency.
Yep, one thousand
Yeah.
percent.
Nothing, no situation will determine your character. Only you have the power to determine your character.
And I think you're more likely to achieve what you want to achieve as an entrepreneur if you have agency.
Yes. I don't know. Because like clickbait, I mean, you can still go down an entrepreneurial clickbait path where it's incongruent and mostly just for the desire to be rich or famous or successful. So I don't necessarily think that you need agency because
Mm.
you can still sell yourself out and be successful as an entrepreneur.
But you would have to let go of, you might have to let go of what your purpose and mission was in order to do
You
the
probably don't
purpose and
have
mission
it to
is,
begin with.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
right. So if you
Yeah.
you can still become an entrepreneur without purpose and mission.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily derive character.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the example I'm thinking of is like, um, you know, Amazon when Jeff Bezos started it, and
Mhm.
people said, "Oh, this is like a bad idea. It's not going to work, etc." And if
Eating
he
that.
didn't have the agency and he listened to that, it wouldn't have happened. He might have still been able to build
Absolutely.
something else successful. I don't know, maybe not, but um, definitely wouldn't have been able to create something completely new.
Mhm. Yes. Yes, but entrepreneurs don't always create something completely new.
Yep. Yeah.
And
So maybe
and
it's
so yes, so
invention.
if it's invention, if it's innovative invention that goes against social structure or grain,
Yeah.
then you probably do require a ton of agency because people will tell you that it's
Mhm.
ridiculous. I mean, I don't know how many people have told me that I don't have a real job. So,
Yeah.
like you do need a certain sense of self-possession in those situations, but you can be an entrepreneur without being in that position.
It's actually innovator that we're talking about, which is
Yeah. Somebody who's
I
going to
think
disrupt the apple
disruptor,
cart.
yes. Yeah, and
Mhm.
it's not just for entrepreneurs either. It's also for somebody building a career in a corporation too. Like they
Mhm.
want to stand out and be innovative. They also have to have agency.
Have agency. Yes.
Yeah, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I know that like for myself, a lot of my life has been driven by career, and I know for a lot of people it is. And this is sort of like another reason if something you value is your ability to innovate and create impact on the world, that's a reason why this entire conversation is important, right?
Absolutely. And the thing is, and you don't even have to desire that. I mean, shared experience also perpetuates for the right audience
Mm-hmm.
a different understanding of something and innovates a mental model or a social construct. And so the point of conversations like this is basically just to expand our boundaries, right? Or where we see a definite line to make that definite line a finite line or a questionable line.
Yeah. I think also if another reason is to, at least for me, it's to keep myself continuing on this trajectory. If it's like adding further fuel for me to continue on the trajectory of authenticity, self agency, internal orientation. Um, and so what what are fuels for you in that regard that keep you on this trajectory?
Being a better version of myself than I was yesterday.
So you wake up in the morning and you think about how can I be a better version of myself today?
I don't think in those exact terms, but for example, if I had an experience yesterday where on review, I could handle it better. That
Mm,
thing that I want to embody, I integrate the next day, right? And so I seek out opportunities to either enact that or rectify that behavior from yesterday in a new way. And then how do I apply that thing I learned to everything else that I take on, and what value does it add in that regard?
mm. As you were saying that, I was feeling similarly, and the things that came to mind, because to ask the question like, how am I a better version of this person I was yesterday today, is in what context? Um, because it could be relationships, it could be work, it could be play, it could be
All context,
all the
all context,
context, right? Yeah,
all the context, right? It's not
absolutely.
specific to one.
But I don't know if this is true for you, but for me, some contexts motivate me more than others. Is that true for you?
No, because I'm still the person showing up in all those contexts. And so I'm a huge believer in example. And so if I would like for the world to be better and be more human focused, how do I show up in every single one of those situations that I set the example that somebody else would see that?
Hmm. Yeah, I think where I was thinking, because you're saying that you'll do it in every context,
Mhm.
and I agree with that. I want to do it in every context too. But the
Yeah.
ones that
But I'm not,
the reason,
what motivates you more out of all the contexts?
yeah, it's not so much now that you said that. Maybe it's not what motivates me more, but it's more like what started me down this path. And for me, it was relationships and career. Like those, like, oh, I want to get better at relationships. I want to get better at my career, and then I start, you know.
But
And
those
then
things
remember
would
we
have
talked about,
evolved. Yeah,
yeah,
because you would have got better at some of those things and you would have found underlying things that made you bad at those things.
mhm,
And
yep,
so now that would have evolved well past that based on what I can
yep,
gauge of
and
your.
that's what's happened.
Mm.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think for some people, so I guess that was what I was trying to get to for you is like, did it start with something, or was there one thing that, like you talked about the marriage, that's a relationship context.
Yeah, but it had nothing to do with getting out of that relationship and being better in a next relationship. It had more to do with discovering why I was so despondent and what I needed for myself in myself to not be and to not do that again.
Was there some, I mean, I don't, maybe you've been on this, like, I want to be a better version of myself every day since you were born.
No, absolutely not. I
Yeah.
just told you that I was
Yeah.
completely incongruent for like 24
Yeah.
years of my life.
Yeah.
So no.
Exactly. Yeah. So what was that first thing that, what context was it that first got you down this path?
Probably it was probably the fact that I lived my life for expectation and other people. And so then I had figuring out what my expectation for myself, one that I was allowed to have an expectation for myself and be a person of my own free will and right.
Mhm.
And then how what that looked like as a life and what that looked like as me as a person in particular things. I actually did a yes year. So everything that I have, like everything was yes. Everything that came across my
Mm.
path, I had to say yes to. I had to do it, whether I liked it, whether I had a previous experience, whether I knew nothing about it.
A
Everything had to
yes,
be yes.
a yes year where
Everything.
the whole year is just yes to everything.
Everything is yes. Right. And so I thought that I hated fishing, and I said yes to go on a deep sea fishing trip. Turns out I love deep sea fishing. It is exhilarating. Right. And so all the things that I thought, I always used to think I hated Brussels sprouts because my mum used to make me eat Brussels sprouts. But so the only thing with yes is you have to have a neutral. You can't take all your preconceived ideas of the thing with you if you
You have to
have
give it a
them.
fair
So you,
chance.
yeah, you have to give it like a neutral ground. So you can't sit in front of the plate of Brussels sprouts going, "Oh my god, I hate Brussels sprouts," because you're
Yeah.
still gonna hate Brussels sprouts, right? Turns out I love Brussels sprouts. You just have to cook them a certain way. You just have to cook. I don't like the way my mum cooked Brussels sprouts when I was a kid. So I did that. And then that year probably didn't so much as, I mean, it showed me plenty of things I liked that I'd never done and rewired ideas of things I had previously. But what it did show me was that I had the ability to do something and discern for myself what it really was for me without an expectation or an idea or a perception or without the pressure that I was expected to like something or dislike something. And so I carried that forward into understanding my own, if we want to use the word agency, that I had it. And so then I started using that in all that those tools and the resources that I built. I started using them in every aspect of my life.
So basically, what you did was you, in order to develop that muscle of discernment of what is aligned with you, you didn't do it by saying no to everything. You did it by saying yes
Mm-hmm.
to everything. And it's
Everything.
like doing a taste test at the buffet. You can't. Yeah, yeah. I think that's brilliant, and I think that's really good advice for people because I think this whole conversation, you could imagine taking everything we said and turning it into a very intellectual exercise. But that's not going to get you anywhere. You have to actually go out and do
And
things
do. Mhm. Yeah,
to.
because the doing, the consuming, the creating, that's the thing that creates your mental model, right?
Mm.
Your intellectual consumption does not create mental models. It creates understanding of models that exist. But if you have mental models, you're mostly going to apply them to the things that you use. It's your actual actions that change your mental models.
what what was hard about, like, if somebody was going to go do a yes year, I think a lot of things come up, right? Like fear of, I might taste that and oh, it's gross, or I might do that, it's scary, or like, did you run into that? Was it like this emotional thing, or?
And look, I had hard nose. Like I wasn't going to become a drug addict. I wasn't going to get into drugs, and I,
Mhm.
I wasn't going to
No one way
consume
doors,
alcohol
no one way
endlessly.
doors.
Yeah, no, yeah,
Yeah,
no. There was no one way doors, right? I wasn't going
yeah,
to. I mean, I have tattoos, but I wasn't going to tattoo something ridiculous on myself that I
yeah.
couldn't undo,
Hmm.
right?
Yep.
Yeah, I wouldn't get plastic surgery. Anything that I couldn't that was irreversible was
Hmm.
still a hard no, right?
Yep.
But the thing about all right, so one interesting because I didn't really I think I was so at the point where I just needed to discover something. I didn't have a ton of fear, but there were preconceived fears that I went into that year with. And so, for example, I used to be terrified of ladders. I would never, I mean, I'd get up a ladder if I had to pick something,
Ladders,
but
like the things you climb, not
ladder, like,
letters. Yeah.
yeah, the
Okay.
climber.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, right. Sorry. Yeah, accent.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the thing with the rung that you press
Yeah.
up against something
Yeah.
else, and like, so
Yeah.
I have been on a ladder in my life,
Uh-huh.
but
Yeah.
they
No, I
terrify
don't
me.
blame you.
They're so unstable.
Yep.
It's just, yeah, it's terrifying.
People
So
die on
I'm
those
on
things.
this, right, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I don't really have a fear of much else except for that. So I go on this deep sea fishing trip and I'm saturated because there's water everywhere.
Mhm.
And one of the guys on the boat climbs up to the crow's nest and says to me, "Hey, come up here. The view's amazing." And I just look up at this slippery, ladder that is perpendicular on this boat that's doing, 30 knots an hour. I'm like, oh no, but I really want to see what he can see from the crow's nest because it was a big
Hmm.
boat. So I have to climb up the ladder, wet, slippery, and moving in the water. And I am terrified, absolutely terrified. But I climbed up it. And that one thing showed me that my fear was all in my head. And so I have never been scared of ladders since that day.
That's
And so you're
what mode?
scared. You may just at the view. And I wasn't allowed to
Mhm.
say no.
Right. Yeah, and
So
so I think like
you,
that's like it's a metaphor for the entire yes year. It was like a big ladder,
mhm, yeah,
and
absolutely. And the thing is that you'll find that your fears are they're so superficial. Majority of what you fear is only skin deep and not really something that you're terrified of. And anything that's attached to a traumatic experience that has generated fear is again an external validation of something, right? And so once you again it's giving away your agency or your power to the traumatic experience or the terrible thing that happened to you, rather than having self-possession and understanding all the tools and resources that you have even in face of the scary thing to do it, and to face it. And so instead of running away from all those things, the yes you makes you confront them.
yeah, it's forcing you to be triggered and work through all those triggers like you did with the ladder.
You don't learn how to swim if you're not in the water.
Yeah, and I think like in our society, there's a lot of like, avoidance of being triggered.
Yeah, because we bond with our triggers, right? We bond with our triggers and we bond with our trauma just like we bond with other people. And we
Mhm.
make them parts of our identity, right? And so that we recognize ourselves. And we'll always love the saying, like, you will never exceed the opinion you have of yourself because
Mm.
as you accumulate experiences and traumatic things that happen to you, you self identify with those things and they become part of who you are. And we avoid seeing those parts of ourselves, even though they're actually not parts of who we are. We just make them, we attach ourselves to them in that way. They don't have to be. But once we start to self identify as those things or being those things, it becomes far more surgical to remove them.
Right. When somebody says I'm an anxious person or I'm a people pleaser.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, I've been both. I had full blown anxiety when coming up to my wedding for like 2 years. So
As
I,
a but you weren't an anxious person, you just were a person experiencing anxiety.
yes, which made me an anxious person, which made it really easy to identify as an anxious person. But
Mhm.
I'm not, my natural state was not actually anxious at all.
Mhm. And this yes year helped you release that.
Yeah. I mean, I think walking away from the situation had a great deal to do with releasing that because I
Mhm.
think a huge part of what created my anxiety was because I was in a situation that was so incongruent
Mm.
to
Right.
me and I was so triggered by it that I was constantly anxious. And I think the fact that on some level I knew that I was in the wrong situation also added to my anxiety because I was almost like denying myself the understanding that I already had. So yes, just leaving that situation in itself, kind of the everyday level of anxiety that I was experiencing eased. And then it was more about understanding what I'd attached to that triggered that anxiety to resurface on an occasion, which was done by the yes year definitely helped with that.
Yeah. I love that idea of the yes year reminds me of some that's a huge commitment, a whole entire year. But there's smaller
I actually did it for
exercises.
longer than that, but
Oh wow.
that was my commitment. Yeah,
Did
I
it
think I did it for
become
about it just became a thing, right? And
Yeah.
so now I still do it, right? Like if I
Mhm.
haven't, if I've experienced it since that time and I didn't like it, I will try it once again. But if I still don't like it, it's not for me. But anything that I have never experienced, I'm not allowed to say no to.
Yeah, that's that's really cool. I was going to get to, um, what's is there a baby step that somebody could take that isn't like, if a yes year is like run, like,
Too much. Terrified.
yeah,
um,
because
either
it's always good to
start
take a
with
baby step and then crawl, walk, run, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm really not really into baby steps. Like
No,
I just
you go
dive off
straight
the
in. You
deep end.
dive in the deep
Yeah, I
end
just
here.
yeah, yeah.
I'm talking
I'm
about
on
for
the
the rest of
tallest
us.
diving board. Like
Yeah.
yeah. But that must just be something that I've had in me always because even when I was in
Mm.
situations where it wasn't congruent, I still did the straight off the tallest diving board thing. Um, but I think you can do it one of two ways. You could either say be open to doing something that you have never done before. So instead of like if you're the kind of person that doesn't do new things, you could try just one thing that you haven't tried before. Or you could retry something that you think you don't like. Right. Just pick one thing. And it can just be a food. Like, I mean, if you're allergic to something, don't eat it. But if you don't like it, you can still, like, it's not going to kill you if you don't like it. And, you can rinse your mouth out or eat something else different. Or so, something that you think you don't like or something you've never tried are always either or places to start. But a really simple thing that I actually used to tell people to do when they freaked out about my yes year was that if they go back to the same restaurant, they're not allowed to order the same thing on the menu. They're never allowed to
Ooh,
eat the same thing from the same place,
I don't know. That's
right?
that's asking a
And
lot,
so,
Jamie.
so if you go to a restaurant regularly, every time you go back, you have to try something different on the menu until you've tried everything on the menu.
I mean,
That's a
that's a
pretty
really good
easy.
one. Yeah, and it's a good one
Hmm,
too, because the reason why a lot of times we order the same thing is because we're afraid of the disappointment of trying something that we might not like.
absolutely.
Um, I think this has been so, not just interesting and fun, but just so informative. And you've given me a lot of interesting things to think about, and also some frameworks I can apply. I'm sure other people will hopefully benefit from this too. So I want to thank you for taking the time to share all of this with me and with everybody who might be listening.
Thank you for having me. I mean, I always love when somebody's curious about something, the questions that they ask. It definitely always challenges my idea of things and how I have to respond or communicate the way that I see the world. So I really appreciate one being challenged, but two for having the opportunity to discuss it with you.
Yeah, it's sort of a form of co-creation and co-understanding, right? It's so awesome. How where can people find you?
Probably the easiest is jamiemyerenterprises.com or Jamie My Enterprises on social media.
Awesome. We'll put it in the description. And thank you again, Jamie. It's been awesome having you.
Thanks so much, Alex. I really appreciate it.